We are glad to welcome you to the Lucas History Channel. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more stories like this. Enjoy your viewing. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. My leg bounced involuntarily as I sat in the rigid plastic chair, trying not to think about the news the doctor might have for me. Across the room, the old wall clock ticked loudly, each second dragging on like an eternity. Beth was seated next to me, flipping through a magazine she wasn't reading. She'd been unusually quiet during the drive here, her usual chatter replaced by an air of something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe? No, that couldn't be it. Beth was always the picture of composure, a master at keeping her emotions locked away. It was part of what had made me fall for her, a quiet strength wrapped in a smile that could disarm anyone. I glanced at her, hoping she'd meet my gaze, but she didn't. Instead, her eyes flicked toward the office door, as if she were waiting for someone, or something. My stomach tightened, but I pushed the thought away. It had been a tough few months, between the constant doctor visits and the stress of my declining health. I couldn't blame her for being on edge. The nurse finally called my name, and Beth snapped out of her daze. "Ready?" she asked, her voice steady. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was. Together, we walked into Dr. Ellison's office. He greeted us with his usual warm smile, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of his domain. He was a tall man, late 40s maybe, with graying hair that lent him an air of authority. His voice was calm, soothing even, as he began asking about my symptoms and detailing the next steps in my treatment plan. But as he spoke, I noticed something odd. Beth was watching him, intently. Her body angled ever so slightly toward him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The way her lips parted, as if on the verge of saying something, yet holding back. It was subtle, but it was there. My mind brushed against a memory, a flash of her smiling at him during our last visit, laughing at one of his lame jokes. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. But now, sitting here, the pieces began to click into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. Dr. Ellison finished his explanation and smiled at me, but his gaze flickered to Beth, lingering just a moment too long. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his tone softer now, "how have you been holding up? It can't be easy." Her response came quickly, too quickly. "I'm fine," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Just focused on getting Mark better." I watched the exchange like an outsider, as though the scene were playing out on a screen in front of me. A knot of unease tightened in my chest, and my voice came out sharper than I intended when I said, "We're doing fine. Both of us." Dr. Ellison's smile faltered, but only for a second. "Of course," he said, rising to his feet. "Let's focus on getting you back to full health, Mr. Johnson." Beth avoided my gaze as we left the office. In the car, I couldn't bring myself to ask the question swirling in my mind. Instead, we drove in silence, the tension between us thick enough to choke on. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. Could I be imagining things? Stress playing tricks on my mind? Or was there something more, a betrayal that had been hiding in plain sight all along? The next day, I woke up early, still tangled in the web of doubt and suspicion from the night before. Beth was already up, the sound of the shower running down the hall. For a moment, I considered confronting her, but what would I even say? "Beth, were you flirting with my doctor?" It sounded absurd, even in my head. But the feeling wouldn't let go. At breakfast, Beth moved around the kitchen with a practiced ease, pouring coffee, buttering toast, smiling like everything was perfectly normal. I wanted to believe it was. Maybe I was just seeing things that weren't there. Maybe stress was making me paranoid. But when she handed me a mug of coffee, her fingers brushed mine for a fraction of a second too long, then immediately pulled away, like the contact had startled her. The thought lingered as we drove to the hospital for another appointment. Beth insisted on coming along again, even though I told her she didn't have to. You shouldn't be doing this alone, she'd said, her tone almost apologetic. It was hard to argue with that, though I couldn't shake the sense that her concern wasn't entirely about me. The waiting room was just as oppressive as before. Tick, tick, tick went the clock on the wall. I stared at the door, trying not to picture Beth and Dr. Ellison behind it, sharing smiles, quiet jokes, perhaps more. When the nurse called my name, Beth stood, smoothing her skirt as if preparing for something important. I caught her glancing at the office door, and the knot in my chest twisted tighter. We followed the nurse into the exam room, and moments later, Dr. Ellison entered with his clipboard and that familiar, too warm smile. "Good to see you again," he said, directing the greeting at both of us. The appointment started routinely enough. He reviewed my recent test results, laid out a plan for the coming weeks, and asked a few questions about my symptoms. But as the conversation progressed, I noticed the same pattern from yesterday. Beth was leaning forward slightly, nodding at everything he said, her body language betraying an attentiveness that went beyond concern. I decided to test the waters. "Beth," I said casually, "why don't you wait in the car? This shouldn't take much longer, and I'll be fine." Her head snapped toward me, her expression caught somewhere between surprise and panic. "Why?" she asked, a little too quickly. "I'm already here. I want to stay." Dr. Ellison glanced between us, his expression unreadable. "It's no problem," he said smoothly. "She's welcome to stay if she wants." Something about the way he said it set my teeth on edge. My stomach churned as I forced a smile. Of course. The rest of the appointment passed in a haze, my mind racing with questions I wasn't ready to ask. When it was finally over, we walked back to the car in silence. Beth didn't speak until we were halfway home. "Are you mad at me?" she asked, her voice cautious. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Why would I be mad? You've been acting distant. Is something bothering you?" I stole a glance at her. She was biting her lip, a nervous habit I hadn't seen in years. I wanted to call her out right then and there, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not without proof. "No," I said after a long pause. "I'm just tired." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, but the tension between us remained. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the faint glow of the digital clock on the nightstand. The thought wouldn't let go. It whispered in the darkness, insidious and persistent, "What if you're right?" The next morning, I made a decision. If there was something going on, I needed to know. When Beth left to run errands, I called the hospital. "This is Mark Johnson," I said, doing my best to sound calm. "I'd like to confirm an appointment." The receptionist was polite and efficient, and within minutes, I had what I needed, a detail that turned my blood cold. Beth had an appointment of her own, scheduled for the following day. With Dr. Ellison. The revelation sat heavy in my chest, like a weight pressing down on my ribs. I stared at the phone in my hand, the hospital receptionist's words echoing in my head. Beth's appointment. With him. What could she possibly need to see him about? And why hadn't she mentioned it? I spent the rest of the day in a fog, replaying every interaction I'd witnessed between them. Every glance, every word, every subtle shift in their body language. It all pointed to something I didn't want to believe. My heart fought against the conclusion, but my gut was screaming the truth. When Beth returned home later that afternoon, I tried to act normal. She breezed through the door with a smile, holding a bag of groceries. "Picked up your favorite soup," she said, setting the bag on the counter. "Thought it might help with your energy." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks." She tilted her head, studying me. "You sure you're okay? You've seemed a little off lately." "Just tired," I said, keeping my tone even. "The treatments take it out of me." Her face softened, and she reached for my hand. "I know. But you're strong, Mark. We'll get through this together." Her touch was warm, reassuring, but it didn't comfort me. It only added to the storm brewing inside. Together? If we were truly in this together, why was she hiding things from me? That night, after she went to bed, I sat in the living room, staring at the darkened TV screen. My mind churned with questions and suspicions. If I confronted her now, she'd deny everything. I needed something concrete. Proof. The next morning, I told Beth I wasn't feeling well enough to leave the house. "I'll just rest today," I said, feigning exhaustion. She looked concerned. "Are you sure? I can stay home if you need me." "No," I said quickly. "You've been doing so much already. Go run your errands. I'll be fine." She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. Call me if you need anything." I watched her leave, her car disappearing down the street. As soon as she was gone, I grabbed my keys and followed. I kept a safe distance, heart pounding as I trailed her through town. She stopped at a pharmacy first, then a coffee shop, but I barely noticed. I was waiting for one destination, and when she finally pulled into the hospital parking lot, my breath caught in my throat. She parked near the back entrance, far from the main lot. I parked a block away and walked, careful to keep out of sight. My pulse thundered in my ears as I entered the building and found a spot in the waiting area where I could see her without being seen. Minutes ticked by. She sat there, flipping through a magazine, her posture tense. When Dr. Ellison appeared in the doorway, her entire demeanor shifted. She smiled, bright and genuine, and stood to greet him. My stomach turned. They exchanged a few words I couldn't hear, and then he led her down the hall, his hand lightly brushing her back. The gesture was small, but it was enough to confirm what I'd been dreading. I waited a few minutes before standing and heading down the same hall. I kept my footsteps light, my movements deliberate. When I reached the door they had entered, I hesitated, pressing my ear against it. Their voices were muffled, but I could make out the tone. Friendly. Familiar. Too familiar. I knew I couldn't stay there without risking being caught, so I stepped back and retreated to the waiting room. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I had seen enough to know the truth, but not enough to confront her without giving her room to wriggle out of it. I needed more. When Beth finally emerged, nearly an hour later, her face was flushed, her expression lighter. She didn't see me as she walked back to her car, her steps quick and deliberate. I waited until she was gone before leaving myself, every step feeling heavier than the last. At home, I barely spoke to her. She didn't seem to notice, her mood brighter than it had been in weeks. "I have a good feeling about tomorrow," she said as we lay in bed that night. "Dr. Ellison thinks we're making real progress." I stared at the ceiling, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. Progress. That's what she called it. In the silence of the darkened room, I made up my mind. Tomorrow, I would confront her. And when I did, there would be no turning back. The morning came too quickly, dragging with it a gnawing sense of inevitability. Beth was in high spirits, humming softly as she moved around the kitchen. Her cheerfulness felt like a cruel mockery of the storm brewing inside me. "Do you need anything while I'm out?" she asked, pausing in the doorway with her bag slung over her shoulder. "No," I replied evenly, not looking up from the newspaper I wasn't really reading. "I'll be fine." She hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly. "Are you sure? You've seemed so distant lately." I finally met her gaze, forcing a faint smile. "I'm just tired, Beth. Go on. I'll be here when you get back." Her face softened, and she nodded. "Okay. Love you." The words hit like a punch to the gut. I couldn't bring myself to respond, so I just nodded. She lingered for a moment before heading out the door. The second I heard her car pull away, I moved. I had a plan, though it felt fragile, cobbled together in the restless hours of the night. I followed her again, this time prepared to face whatever truth lay behind her actions. As I expected, she drove straight to the hospital, parking in the same out-of-the-way spot as before. My hands clenched the steering wheel, my knuckles white as I watched her disappear into the building. This time, I didn't wait long before following. I entered through a side door and took a different route to the area where I knew Dr. Ellison's office was located. My heart pounded as I scanned the hallway, looking for anything out of place. I stopped near a supply closet, close enough to hear muffled voices coming from the exam room where I'd seen them yesterday. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was enough, soft, intimate, with bursts of quiet laughter. It felt like a knife twisting in my chest. My breath came shallow, anger and betrayal threatening to consume me. I had to see them. I had to know for sure. Without giving myself time to second-guess, I pushed the door open. The room fell silent. Beth and Dr. Ellison froze, their expressions shifting from surprise to something more complicated, guilt on her face, irritation on his. "Mark!" Beth exclaimed, her voice an octave higher than normal. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I said, my voice low and trembling with barely contained rage. "That's a question I should be asking you." Dr. Ellison stepped forward, his professional facade slipping into place. "Mr. Johnson, I can assure you." "Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't even try to explain. I've seen enough." Beth reached for me, her expression panicked. "Mark, this isn't what it looks like." "Oh, it's not." I snapped, stepping back to avoid her touch. "Then please, enlighten me. What exactly is going on here? Why are you meeting him alone? Why didn't you tell me about these appointments?" Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Her silence was deafening. Dr. Ellison cleared his throat, his tone measured. "Mr. Johnson, your wife came to me with concerns about how to support you during your treatment. This is purely..." "Purely what?" I cut him off again. "Purely professional. Because I don't think professional doctors laugh like that with their patients' wives. Or touch them like I saw you do yesterday." Beth gasped. "You followed me?" "Yes, I did." My voice rose, and I didn't care who heard. Because I had to know. And now I do. Her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "Mark, please, it's not what you think. We were just..." "Just what?" I demanded. "Tell me, Beth. How far has this gone? How long have you been lying to me?" Dr. Ellison stepped closer, but I turned on him. "Don't even think about saying another word. You've done enough." Beth sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "It was just... I didn't know how to handle everything. You've been so distant, and I felt so alone." "Alone?" My voice broke. "You felt alone, so you turned to him." "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you." The words were empty, hollow. My chest felt like it was caving in. I turned away, unable to look at either of them. "You've already hurt me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's nothing left to say." Without another word, I walked out of the room, leaving her sobs and Dr. Ellison's futile attempts at damage control behind. The hallway felt endless, each step heavier than the last. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was trembling, the weight of what had just happened threatening to crush me. Sitting in the car, I realized there was no going back. This was the end of something I had once thought unbreakable. And now, I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces, alone. The drive home felt surreal, as if I were moving through a fog. The familiar streets passed by in a blur, and I barely registered the other cars or the people walking along the sidewalks. My mind was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness, and a hollow kind of disbelief. How had it come to this? When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't get out of the car immediately. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring blankly at the house. The place where we had built a life together. Where we had shared laughter, tears, and the milestones of raising 3 beautiful children. It felt foreign now, like a facade of what I thought I knew. Finally, I forced myself inside. The quiet of the house was oppressive. I sank into the living room couch, my head in my hands. I didn't want to cry, but the tears came anyway, hot and relentless. I let them fall, letting the pain pour out of me in waves. It wasn't just Beth's betrayal, it was the loss of the life we had built, the shattering of the trust one had placed in her. It was the death of something I had held sacred. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping me out of my spiral. The screen lit up with Beth's name. I let it ring. A few moments later, it buzzed again, a voicemail. Then another. And another. When the buzzing finally stopped, I reached for the phone, hesitating before playing the messages. The first one was her voice, trembling with tears. "Mark, please. I don't even know where to start. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. Please, let me come home and explain everything. We can fix this. I love you." Her words stung, but they felt hollow. The second message wasn't much different, filled with apologies and pleas for understanding. By the third, her voice had shifted, desperation giving way to frustration. "You're not answering. How are we supposed to fix this if you won't talk to me? You're blowing this out of proportion, Mark. Nothing happened. I mean, okay, maybe there was a moment, but it didn't mean anything. You've been so withdrawn lately, and I was scared. Scared of losing you." I stopped the message there, my jaw clenching. Scared of losing me? Was that supposed to justify her actions? I deleted the rest without listening. Whatever excuses she had, I didn't need to hear them. They wouldn't change what she'd done. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, trying to decide what to do next. The thought of calling a lawyer crossed my mind, but it felt so final. I wasn't sure if I was ready to take that step yet. But one thing was certain, I couldn't stay in this limbo, waiting for answers that would only bring more pain. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, there was a knock at the door. My heart sank. I knew it was her before I even opened it. Beth stood on the porch, her face streaked with tears. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of her guilt had physically diminished her. "Mark," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please. Just hear me out." I didn't say anything, stepping aside to let her in. She hesitated before walking past me into the living room, her movements tentative, as if she were walking on broken glass. "I made a mistake," she began, turning to face me. "I let things get too personal with Dr. Ellison. But it wasn't what you think. Nothing happened, nothing physical. I swear." I crossed my arms, my voice colder than I intended. "Nothing physical, but emotional. Is that supposed to make it better?" She flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I was scared, Mark. I felt like I was losing you, and he was there. He listened. And I didn't." My voice rose, years of bottled-up frustration bubbling to the surface. "I've been fighting through all this, Beth, trying to hold on for you, for our kids, and you turned to him?" Her sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't know what else to do. You shut me out, Mark. I felt invisible. I wanted to yell, to scream at her, but the words caught in my throat. I turned away, staring out the window into the night. You should have come to me, I said finally, my voice hollow. We could have faced this together. Instead, you made a choice that broke us. She stepped closer, her voice pleading. I'll do anything to fix this. Just tell me how. I'll go to therapy. I'll quit my job if I have to. Please, Mark. Don't give up on us. I turned to face her, meeting her tear-filled eyes. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I could. The love I once felt for her was still there, buried beneath the rubble of betrayal. But could it ever be enough to rebuild what we had lost? The weight of Beth's words hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. Her tear-streaked face, the desperation in her eyes, it all pulled at the part of me that had once been so deeply in love with her. But love, I realized in that moment, wasn't always enough. It couldn't undo the betrayal. It couldn't erase the doubt. Beth, I said finally, my voice steady but strained. I need time. Her expression crumpled. Time, she repeated, her voice a mix of disbelief and fear. What does that mean? Are you leaving? I shook my head, though the motion felt like a lie. I'm not leaving. Not yet. But I can't just pretend everything's okay. I need space to figure out what's next, for me, for us. She stepped closer, her hand reaching for mine. I didn't pull away, but I didn't meet her touch halfway either. Mark, please, she whispered. Let me make it right. I'll do anything. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw not just the woman who had betrayed me, but the woman I had shared a life with, the mother of my children, my partner through a decade of ups and downs. The thought of walking away from all of that felt like an amputation, a severing of something I wasn't sure I could survive without. And yet, staying felt equally impossible. I can't make any promises, I said, each word a struggle. I need to think. And I need you to be honest with me, completely honest. No more half-truths, no more excuses. If we're going to even try to rebuild this, it has to start with the truth. She nodded quickly, her tears falling faster now. You'll have it, she said. I swear. No more secrets. I pulled my hand away gently, stepping back to create the distance I desperately needed. I think you should stay with your sister for a while. Give me some space to sort through everything. Her face fell, but she didn't argue. Okay, she said quietly. If that's what you need. I walked her to the door, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. She paused on the threshold, turning to look at me one last time. I love you, Mark, she said. No matter what happens, I'll always love you. I didn't respond. I couldn't. She lingered for a moment, then stepped out into the night, leaving me alone in the echoing silence of the house we had built together. For a long time after she left, I just sat there, staring at nothing. The house felt colder without her presence, but the emptiness was oddly comforting. It gave me room to breathe, to think. Over the next few weeks, I focused on myself, on healing, both physically and emotionally. I sought out therapy, not for our marriage but for me. I needed to understand how I could move forward, whether that meant rebuilding my life alone or finding a way to forgive Beth and start over. Beth kept her word, staying at her sister's and giving me the space I asked for. She called often, leaving messages I didn't always answer. When we did talk, she was different, quieter, more reflective. She didn't push, didn't demand. She simply listened, her love for me evident in every word she said. It was almost enough to make me believe her. Almost. In the end, it wasn't a single moment or revelation that brought clarity. It was a gradual process, a slow realization that while Beth's betrayal had shattered my trust, it hadn't completely destroyed my love for her. But love wasn't the only ingredient for a successful marriage. It needed trust, too. And trust, I knew, would take time to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. One crisp autumn evening, weeks after she had left, Beth and I sat across from each other at a small cafe. It was the first time we'd seen each other since that night. She looked nervous, her hands clasped tightly around her coffee cup. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said, her voice trembling. But I'm willing to spend the rest of my life trying to earn your trust again, if you'll let me. I stared at her, the woman I had loved and lost and might, just might, be able to love again. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying. I don't know what the future holds, Beth, I said finally. But if you're willing to fight for us, I'll try, too. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of guilt or regret. They were tears of hope. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to feel that hope, too. Thank you for watching to the end. Write in the comments what you liked and what you would like to see next.